Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you to Kieran and everyone at the Offaly Historic Society for having me. It's an absolute honor. And can everybody see the slides on the screen as it is? I hope you guys can. So I'd like to start the talk this evening with two quotes in particular. And so the first quote, it says, I suppose, you know, it's actually one from Queen Elizabeth I herself. And so she apparently said, quote, I find it that I sent wolves, not shepherds, to govern Ireland, for they have left me nothing but ashes and carcasses to reign over. The second quote is from her, apparently from her as well. And it says, quote, God has given such brave soldiers to the crown that if they do not frighten our neighbors, at least they prevent us from being frightened by them. So as the talk actually progresses, you'll start to see why these quotes are so relevant in the overall big picture of 16th century Ireland and the Leix-Offaly plantation. My talk itself is going to be split into three different sections. The first part is going to give you some background on English colonialism and Tudor policy in Ireland. The second part is going to kind of briefly go through the different English captains who held positions within the plantation itself and made up what could be considered a local government at the time. And the final part of the talk is going to look at it from a Gaelic Irish perspective. And it's going to look at how the Gaelic Irish fit into the grand picture and if they partook in the plantation scheme and or if they didn't and why. So I suppose a good place to start is with Patrick Finglas. Now, he was a highly influential Irish judge of the 16th century, and he was the author of the well-known tract or well-known piece of literature known as The Conquest of Ireland and the Decay of the Same. And in his story, he chronicled that William Marshall, who was the first Earl of Pembroke, he had 5 sons and 5 daughters, the latter of which apparently partitioned Leinster between them following the death of their brothers in the 12th century. All the daughters of the said Earl, they apparently married quite prominent lords in England who were really disinterested in their holdings in Ireland or defending them for that matter. So in places like Carlow, for example, they installed Gaelic lords such as the Kavanaghs. And they, one Kavanagh himself, he was the Kavanagh of Idrone, and he fashioned himself as the MacMurra, who was supposed to be a direct link to his genealogy and a link to Diarmuid MacMurra, who of course was the former king of Leinster. And he was installed as somewhat of a puppet leader for the crown. He was put in charge of hoping to safeguard the area for her and their husbands. And what quickly happened then was the move kind of blew up in their face. It spectacularly backfired as the Carlow Lord himself quickly grew in defiance to England, quite enjoyed this new degree of independence that he held in Carlow. And he encouraged the other Gaelic lords of Leinster to do the same. So you had clans like the O'Byrnes, the O'Tooles, the O'Connors, and the O'Carrolls who quickly rose up in combination with the Kavanaghs. And they basically rose in revolt against the remnants of what remained of Norman Ireland. Thus began, I suppose, what many historians nowadays would call the Gaelic Revival or the Gaelic Resurgence, which, according to Patrick Finglas, who I mentioned, was the beginning of the decay of the entire province of Leinster. But all hope was not necessarily lost in the crown's eyes. So by the 16th century, they firmly believed that Leinster could still be recovered and restored to the king's control. And in order to do this, they felt that they would have to grant strongholds and various manors and abbeys, and then their adjoining baronies to able young lords and knights and captains and men, military men who were equipped with bands of soldiers who would resettle the land that was in the hands of the Gaelic Irish and would essentially stem the tide of the Gaelic onslaught. Finglas argued that once these men were equipped with that, they could ensure the land itself could be tilled and adequately inhabited. But the prominent Palesman himself, he was not alone in his aspirations, these grand aspirations of restoring crown control to the troubled island of Ireland. Years earlier, in 1515 to be exact, the government was more than aware the majority of the country was inhabited, quote, by what they deemed to be the king's Irish enemies. They were deemed to have lived by the sword and obey none but those who can subdue them in turn with the sword. In general, the crown and the government itself, they were incredibly wary of the Gaelic Irish and the threat Ireland posed as a whole to the Tudor state and Tudor stability in Ireland. Coupled with this then were the rumors of a potential French invasion and influx of Scots into Ulster in the north. And what happened was the government actually feel that the Gaelic Irish themselves were planning somewhat of a preemptive strike to, quote, like rid themselves of the yoke of England before they were, quote, driven out of their own ancient possessions. So although this was obviously clearly somewhat of an exaggeration and state propaganda at its very finest, there can be little doubt that the various Irish lordships, including, obviously from an Offaly perspective, the O'Carrolls and the O'Connors, among others, they were very much aware of the Tudor government's agenda to lay claim upon their lands and their lordships as a whole. Now, because I'm trying to cover so much in the talk itself, and it's just simply too much to provide complete background of what happened in the lead up to English intervention in Ireland, it has to be said that a significant event occurred before the English actually really started taking an interest in the Midlands and in Ireland in general. And that, of course, was the rebellion of Silken Thomas Fitzgerald in County Kildare. And Silken Thomas Fitzgerald and the Geraldine lords themselves were essentially de facto kings in their own right. And they had been appointed by the crown to maintain control in their name. And what happened with Silken Thomas Fitzgerald's rebellion and revolt against the crown in the 1530s and his ultimate defeat in 1537, and then of course his execution and his uncle's execution in the Tower of London, what it did was essentially create a power vacuum in the Midlands. You had the Geraldine lords of Kildare were essentially done away with. Now you had the Butler lords of Ormond, they remained in the Midlands, but the crown itself knew that it had to take a more hands-on approach in order to maintain law and order. And you had places like the Pale, which were the more, quote, civilized, you could say, areas of Leinster. And they wanted to keep the inhabitants of that area safe from any encroachment from the Gaelic Irish who lived along the borders of the Pale itself. So you had many Tudor reformists in England, such as Walter Cowley. Now, he was based primarily in Ireland. He had the title of Master of the Rolls. And it was crucial for him, it was crucial for the government to strike as swiftly as possible to prevent this preemptive strike that they felt was going to happen. It was just around the corner. So for them, as long as the Gaelic culture actually survived, the Irish would never truly embrace civility or general law and order. And Cowley was not alone in his way of thinking. In fact, from the 12th century onwards, reformers such as Giraldus Cambrensis, he promoted English expansion into Celtic territories so as to introduce English civility in the form of towns and tillage and general commerce to the allegedly savage people who lived there in their alleged idleness in the woods and bogs. And the fundamental problem really remained that the Gaelic Irish were deemed different and treated as such by the Tudor state. Ireland's natives were considered uncivilized and, quote, unreasonable beasts who lived without any knowledge of God or good manners. And they were alleged to have regularly preyed upon the inhabitants of the civilized English Pale with their wild and unkempt mustaches, their wild hairstyles, their lack of good manners, and then not using saddles or stirrups whilst on horseback. This was, of course, supposed to be completely alien to the civilized English. Englishness, on the other hand, was regarded as superior in every way to Irishness. The English were also deemed to be God's elect nation, and God himself was deemed to be an Englishman. In the mid-16th century, during the height of the Reformation then, English identity became Protestant, and England did as well. So England culture was perceived as what we would deem lowland culture. And this was associated with general economic development and, as I mentioned, towns, commerce, and of course, tillage, farming. Gaelic culture, on the other hand, had compact lordships, had limited number of townlands, and unstable, what we would call marcher societies. In the Tudor government's eyes, the Gaelic natives needed to be deterred from this alleged idleness and encouraged to fall to husbandry, which you can see in your screen. They have a definition, which was essentially the care, the cultivation, and the breeding of crops and animals, and move away from their uncivilized lands, which granted them a refuge, where they could preserve their savage ways and continue to threaten the civil inhabitants of the Pale. Yet, in actual reality, the situation was not so clear-cut. We know that the Gaelic Irish themselves actually did raise cattle and practice tillage farming, such as the production of oats, which could grow on even the poorest of soil. But this was marginalized by the Tudors to suit their own agenda. You see, in order to promote the necessity of civilizing Ireland's natives, the Tudor government had to paint the Irish as these wild, barbaric, backward, and savage people in need of saving and in need of salvation. For the Tudor administration, their civilizing crusade was relatively quite straightforward. They wanted to, quote, ordain justices of the peace in the several counties, and one man to be sent from every parish in England to inhabit the lands. So in other words, set up garrisons and small settlements, which are populated with settlers, loyal to the crown, primarily Englishmen, and then they would gradually coerce Ireland's natives towards conformity and hopefully leading a civilized life. If the Gaelic Irish were not willing to conform to this, they were simply to be expelled, pushed aside, and in many cases, simply exterminated. Now, what did the Tudors actually hope to bring about in Leinster as a whole, but primarily in places like Leix and Offaly? Well, I think in order to answer this question properly, we must look to the previous tactics employed by the Crown in places like Scotland, Wales, Louth, and Meath. So Tudor intervention in Scotland, it was really the direct result of the perceived threat from France that I already mentioned. And this was launched, like it was in Ireland, to bring the Scots to heel. The goal was to permanently impose direct rule in Scotland and crush any resistance in the process. English forts were eventually established there by the late 1540s to house permanent English garrisons and secure English influence throughout Scotland. The move was intended to unite England and Scotland into, quote, one isle and one realm, which was clearly God's will, apparently, since the two nations dwelt on one island and they spoke the same language. Yet in the end, the Scottish campaign was ultimately a failure and was resolved with a shaky ceasefire in the year 1549. So the Tudors decided to count their losses and move to Wales. So they actually achieved greater success in Wales than they had done in Scotland. The Act of Union of 1536, it basically converted the Welsh lordships into shires, into county system like we have in Ireland, and incorporated the region as a really integral part of the overall kingdom. Welsh law and their customs were abolished, as was the language itself, and the whole territory was brought under English law and administrative structures. The move proved incredibly effective, and the new system helped to curb the worst disorders or any sort of uprisings or rebellious outbreaks, I suppose, across Wales. It made the Welsh appear on paper to be more civilized, even if that wasn't the situation in reality. So then in Ireland, I mean, the Crown already had taken an active presence in the more loyal portions of Leinster. And so similar ventures had already been attempted in Louth and Meath in the 13th and 14th century. In the early 1300s, Louth was neither peaceful nor obedient, and it had witnessed the murder of its sheriff, a rebellion against the crown, and repeated raids of Scottish raiders, and the massacre of its earl and 160 of its tenants. Louth was also what would be deemed a border region, but nevertheless had English administrative structures and more closely resembled the local societies of England by the 14th century. Gradually, the government encouraged a significant number of English settlers to come across and make their new home in Louth and Meath on good quality land. With the assistance of these local lords and prosperous English settlements, they were really had established effective, fully running shires by the 1220s. These leading landowners then served on the local government of Louth and Meath, and they ensured the border region was well defended and reinforced. The local leading landowners pretty much ruled on their own without really any interference from England as to their day-to-day lives. And so what you saw with places in like Scotland and Wales, and I suppose to a lesser extent in Louth and Meath, was the construction of forts gradually became the defining characteristic of mid-Tudor rule in Ireland. And there's many accounts much later in the century included where the English colonizers, they do make note of drawing inspiration from the ancient Romans themselves and how they used the fort system to curb the worst disorders in a particularly turbulent area. And it became, from the early 16th century onwards, the main means by which they safeguarded the country as a whole. So the Roman ideology itself, it consisted of dominance and control of a particular region and the establishment of strongholds or forts on major routes. And this in turn allowed for the rapid movement of military troops, as well as effective lines of communication and, of course, supply routes. And they were essentially bases from which the Romans and gradually the Tudor crown could launch small or large expeditions in places where the government were confident they could control and protect, with easy access to supplies and communication. So once Leinster was brought under Tudor rule, or once they hoped to bring it under Tudor rule, and any resistance was crushed, the government sought to establish garrisons and in turn English administrative structures in each of these areas. And then Leix and Offaly were really no different. They hoped then they would encourage a significant number of gentry or leading landowners of the upper political class to come across from England and make their home in Ireland, take up local positions within the government. And I think to go forward, I have to just give a really quick breakdown of the three main offices that these people took up in Leix and Offaly. So the first one is the Justices of the Peace. And these were in part, these were quasi-military officers, and they were drawn from the leading landowners of a particular shire, and they were expected to lead the able-bodied men of the shire, some sort of conscription service in defense of the county itself. They were also supposed to hold court where they determined cases of trespassing and felonies, and the military activities in Ireland always remained central for them. So they were obviously, of course, primarily military officers. In the 14th century, they were also supposed to parley with the local Gaelic Irish chiefs, and this did continue into the 16th century, and they were the main ones who were supposed to, as well as the sheriffs, which I'll describe in a second, who were supposed to essentially deal with the local Gaelic chieftains and their clans. The second officer just below that then were the sheriffs, and they were the main shire officer. And they were essentially somewhat of a link between central and local government, and they had military, judicial, and administrative powers and functions. They basically were supposed to clear passes through Gaelic terrain, through the wildest forests, and make a clear path for troops to pass through, and help coordinate the general hosting, which in and of itself was raising the local population, as I mentioned, to fight against any disturbances. They were also supposed to guard prisoners and find juries and produce them for any trial, hang any convicted felons, execute any royal writs, and organize elections to the members of parliament. At a more local level then on the ground were what were deemed, or what were called the constable. And the ones that operated in Leinster and the ones that operated in Leix and Offaly were little other than military officers or commanders of castles and fortifications, usually commanded a small number of troops, roughly 25 to 80 men. And so this is what the Tudors wanted to do in Leix and Offaly. They wanted to come in, quash any resistance to Tudor intervention in the Midlands, and establish these primary offices of local government like there were in England. And without question, peace was always precarious in Leinster and Leix and Offaly throughout the 16th century. The Tudor administration always experienced constant challenges to establishing these systems of local government due to persistent rebellions of the Gaelic natives. When settler societies were finally then established by the early 1550s or even the late 1540s, they were very militaristic and highly militarized in nature, ever organized for war and any repression of Gaelic raids. The government's goal for the overall region, as I said, was to safeguard the Pale, and then in turn gradually advance social and political reform and extend English royal authority at first through Leix and Offaly, gradually throughout the more, what they deemed the wild areas of Leinster, and certainly, I suppose, at the end of the day, gradually the rest of Ireland. But in order to achieve this aim, the captains and the settlers who came across from England, they took up these local offices in the government. And they were instructed to favour any Gaelic lordships who had any sympathies towards the crown, who were willing to cooperate with the crown. Defence was always paramount to their responsibilities. The administration was aware that if it was to stand any real chance to see their aspirations become reality, or of introducing English administrative structures or local government, the maintenance of law and order was imperative. So captains were expected to defend and hold on to the government-held positions and punish any rebels who threatened the existing balances of power. Prior to Leix and Offaly's official shiring, the burden of defence fell to the captains in the local military government and the lieutenant of fort protector and governor. And these, of course, were the forts that were established by the crown, primarily in modern-day Portlaoise and in Dangan in Offaly. And then the local leading landowners then were supposed to offer the assistance then to these local governors. William St. Lo, according to the records, was the first such governor of the two forts, and he was lieutenant primarily in 1548. We don't really know a whole lot about him other than he was born into a quite wealthy family in England, in Somerset in 1520. And upon his appointment in the Midlands, he set about crushing any rebellious clans in the area. So this included primarily in Offaly, the Brian and Cararua O'Connor, and in Leix, the O'Moores. He was deemed by the crown to be, quote, highly competent and efficient in his role. They actually said that he abolished all robberies and felonies in the countryside and brought it to complete peace. He was even said to have challenged any of his officers under his command with any drunkenness or misdemeanors of any kind. But what the government really liked about St. Lo was he was supposed to be a, quote, terrible example to all others. Beware how they did attempt the like. So he was supposed to be the kind of strike fear into the hearts of all the Gaelic lords if they ever dared rebel against the crown. But when you actually read his personal letters, and you read his personal letters sent back to England, he actually seemed to have a real disdain and he distrusted the Gaelic Irish of the region greatly. And in many occasions, he condoned excessive violence against them in putting down any rebellions of any kind. He called them, quote, no better than traitors unto the king's majesty. What a key and stay should be lost if these untrue dissemblers and wavering Irishmen ever revolt. His solution to the rebellions was quite unforgiving, and he proposed that it was, quote, better to give them a sudden scourging plague. So his attitude as a whole wasn't really all that bizarre, it wasn't really all that out there, because it was quite typical of the broader English sentiment at the time. As outlined in my introduction, most Englishmen and most of the Englishmen that came across and in government back in England, they were convinced of the superiority of English society over Gaelic Irish society, with the former deemed civil and the latter deemed savage. For new English arrivals, such as William St. Lo, it was crucial that they were the ones to shape the landscape and its native inhabitants, once conquered in their own image of England. But crucially, for every dutiful officer that we ever come across in all the records in Leix and Offaly, prior to its official shiring, there were several examples of grossly ineffective crown servants. So the first one of these is actually a man known as John Thomas. Now he's really interesting because we know he was the constable of Ballyadam's Castle by 1549. And throughout his career, he was known as a really eager land expansionist. And he eventually acquired extensive estates, primarily in Wexford. And a lot of these were, he acquired them after the dissolution of the monasteries, when the Reformation and the Protestant faith became the de facto religion of England. He also acquired a lot of the mining rights in Wexford, so became quite a wealthy man by the mid-16th century. He was incredibly unpopular throughout the country, and in Dublin, he was known as the, quote, rankest knave and vilest briber, extortioner, and bloodsucker that ever lived, end quote. On top of that, by the end of his career, he apparently embezzled over £10,000 off the Queen herself. And they called her the Queen and her poor subjects. So, I mean, he was not alone in a lot of this behavior. We also have Henry Wise, who was also in Leix, and he and his companion, Patrick Sherlock, they were accused of, quote, dereliction of duty and perpetration of crimes in the winter of 1548. Now, we don't really know a whole lot of what happened in Christmas of 1548, but they apparently led some of the local women from the surrounding area into the fort, and the soldiers of the fort itself got quite merry around Christmas time, and a lot of the stables and a lot of the buildings were actually set on fire by the women that came into the fort. So apparently it was an act of sabotage. So they were reprimanded quite severely by the crown for allowing this behavior to carry on. Then in the later 1550s, when Leix and Offaly were officially shired and became Queen's County and King's County, you had a man known as Henry Radcliffe. He was the brother of Sir Thomas Radcliffe, who was the Lord Deputy of Ireland. And he was appointed the lieutenant of the two forts, like St. Lo before him, but now the two shires as well. He was known to have held on to power through strict implementation of martial law. And he was expected actually to punish, quote, with fire and sword, the Irish of the said two shires. His tenure was marred throughout by allegations of favoritism and nepotism, with the lieutenant himself receiving extensive monastic lands in Wexford, Kilkenny, Carlow, Kildare, Tipperary, and Dublin. With the official shiring then of Leix and Offaly, as I mentioned, he was called back to England to answer charges of financial mismanagement and embezzlement. He was actually imprisoned by the Crown for these charges. And then, like the Geraldine Earls of Kildare, and like with their absence from the Midlands, Henry Radcliffe's absence from the Midlands opened another vacuum of power, which new settlers coming from England were more than happy to fill. And so the two men who took up positions in Leix and Offaly, the first in Leix was a man known as Francis Cosby, which many of you may know, and the other man in Offaly was Henry Cowley. Now, these men couldn't have been any different from one another. They were completely polar opposites. Cosby himself, he was a military man. He had served in the Low Countries in his early years, and he himself was married to a sister of Protector Somerset, who had a fall from grace when Edward died, and Mary acceded to the throne. So he had to get out of England. He was actually in fear of his life. He faced execution. So he fled to Ireland, and he took up his position as the Sheriff of Kildare. He then appealed for permission to plant in Leix, and he eventually became part of the committee which surveyed the region and settled there. He eventually served as Justice of the Peace and Sheriff of the county successfully between 1561 and 1566. He was also appointed General of the Kern, which many of you may know is a position where he was in charge of a group of native Irish troops whose responsibility was to hunt down any rebels or their own kin who were causing any disturbances in the surrounding areas. Henry Cowley, on the other hand, was the son of quite prominent lawyer Walter Cowley and grandson of Robert Cowley, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. The family moved quite extensively throughout Ireland, and they eventually settled in Offaly in the King's County in the early 1550s. Like Cosby, Henry's career started in Kildare, where he served as Justice of the Peace in 1558, before implementing martial law throughout King's County from 1559 to 1566 as JP and Sheriff. He was at first praised for his, both men were essentially praised for extending English rule and common law throughout both areas. And this included the tilling of the lands throughout the areas, supporting any loyalist clans. But their commitment to conciliation with the Gaelic Irish or spreading English common law was fragile, to say the least. When the opportunity presented itself for financial gain, like their predecessors, they really, the path to reform strayed quite a bit. Unchecked and with significant powers in their respective territories, Cosby and Cowley controlled the number of Gaelic Irish that were permitted to settle on the plantation itself. And they were quoted to have cheated everyone in the system, and to a greater or lesser extent, they did. By 1565, Francis Cosby was accused of embezzlement of crown funds. In the case of Cowley, his family regularly seized land of what were called Old English, which were originally the remnants of, or the descendants of Norman Ireland. And the crown was pretty much okay with this and didn't seem to ever intervene when the Cowleys moved in and claimed land for themselves. By Elizabeth's reign, the Midlands captains were said to have been driven by profit and authority, rather than, quote, reducing the people to civility and law. Many historians reinforce this argument and claim that in the Midlands in particular, many new English settlers obtained, quote, land, status, wealth, and power there. But the Tudor government hoped that the employment of these captains in turbulent areas such as Francis Cosby and Cowley, it would save the administration money in the long run and eventually impede Gaelic resistance. But this strategy of leaving the English officers to their own devices, it regularly backfired on them, especially during Rory O'More's rebellion in the 1570s. People like Francis Cosby were widely condemned, and then people like Cowley were praised across the board for, quote, using justice with offenders and not permitting any rebel nor any of their race, in other words, the Gaelic Irish, to possess anything in the country. Another eventual sheriff of the Queen's County, Edmund Butler, he was deemed as one of the few men competent enough to govern the country in any way effectively. He was notoriously effective and quite ruthless in carrying out martial law. He claimed the heads of notorious rebels such as Turlough MacShane, Tygo Dowling, and Pierce O'Moore throughout the 1560s. Hence, for those actually committed to their roles of ensuring the government ensured some grip or control of the Midlands, their actions were deemed, quote, necessary service in pursuit of traitors, and served as examples of how other individuals could better serve Her Majesty. But the problem was, throughout, there was always 10 ineffective captains for every effective captain like Henry Cowley. People like Francis Cosby, they overshadowed anything the Crown could deem as success. Francis Cosby himself was berated by Nicholas White, Master of the Rolls, and William Cecil, the Queen's chief advisor, for the total loss of Leix, having refused to use, quote, justice against any offenders. However, negligence such as what Cosby exhibited during his period was unsurprisingly by no means isolated. In the King's County, we have another example in the form of Edward Moore. He was eventually Privy Council, and he was the JP of the Shire later in the 1580s and 90s. But he was firstly recommended for a position in Offaly, quote, for his ableness of body, behavior in the country as a whole, credit abroad, and good experience. He also was a military man, unsurprisingly, and had a stellar military record. He was also quoted as being mere or pure English, and he was well beloved throughout the country. He was descended from a long line of established gentry in Benedin, Kent, in England, and his family and Moore himself travelled to Ireland in the early 1560s, seeking reward and renown. But Moore was regularly accused of working in partnership with the Gaelic Irish lordships and chieftains of the areas that he was stationed in. This included the O'Neills in Ulster, and then, more relevant, he was actually supposed to have worked in cahoots with the O'Connors of Offaly. And they actually were deemed to have worked together to achieve their own individual aims. By the 1580s and the 1590s, the eventual outbreak of the 9 Years' War and Hugh O'Neill's rebellion in the north, the county gentry of the two shires were heavily criticised for not offering more resistance to the rebel onslaught, and for having surrendered their strongholds, quote, most vilely and cowardly, being well furnished with munitions and victuals. Thomas Lee, who was an Elizabethan army captain, even claimed that negligent captains, quote, cost Her Majesty many thousands of pounds to recover the two shires from the traitors, in other words, the Gaelic Irish. And it goes without saying that this criticism, as everybody has seen over the last couple of slides, it certainly had a basis. You had officers in Offaly quite later, such as George Cowley and Henry Warren. George Cowley was the son of the aforementioned Henry Cowley. They were criticised for failing to attend their duties and prevent the destruction of the overall county. It was said that George Cowley and Henry Warren failed to put up practically any resistance to the Gaelic rebellions of the 1580s and 90s, and completely neglected their overall duties. As many of you may or may not know, where we had Rory O'Moore's rebellion in the 1570s, we had a subsequent rebellion by his son, Oni MacRory O'Moore, in the 1590s, actually 1596, right up until his death in 1600 in a skirmish with the Crown. And during this period, we know that Leix had basically hung on by a thread because of an English captain known as St. Ledger in Leix. In Offaly, we actually know that the county was completely overrun and the Crown basically held no control there. Now, of course, there were exceptions to this, as I mentioned, in the form of Worm, St. Ledger and Francis Rush in Leix, but in Offaly itself, it was really a bit of a disaster. And why, you may ask, did a lot of these captains not put up more of a resistance to these rebellions that seemed to happen throughout the 16th century? But in reality, this commitment to the Crown, or the commitment to the aspirations of the government, it always seemed to come at a heavy price for the settlers themselves. For example, in the Queen's County in Leix, we had one sheriff known as Thomas Lambin. He was burnt out of his townland of Morris near Ballybritis, and was forced to watch helplessly as all of his tenants were killed and his possessions were carried away. Another sheriff, John Barnes, he claimed that the O'Moore stole 140 cattle, 1,000 sheep, calves, and 126 plough horses from his possessions, as well as burning and spoiling all of his lands and killing all of his tenants. And we even see the seasoned veteran Henry Cowley in Offaly, who actually many times paid out of his own pocket for the defence of his holdings and those of his tenants for their overall defence. We find him completely destitute by the late 16th century, with his home being burnt to the ground, including all of his lands, most of his tenants being killed off, and financially bankrupt. His nephew, in fact, was Robert Cowley, who was a sheriff of Phillipstown in the 1570s, was actually killed in action in the summer of 1573, when the O'Connors stormed the fortification and killed him, cornered him and killed him in the fort itself. Crown forces throughout this period were completely outnumbered. In Leix, we know they were completely outnumbered at least 3-1. And we know that Offaly, as I said, was completely overrun on many occasions. Sir Thomas Moore, he was the brother of the Edward Moore that I just mentioned. He was slain alongside his two daughters at his home in Croghan in the 1590s during these disturbances. And his wife was actually allegedly, quote, stripped in the bog and left to die from exposure to the elements. Other officers, such as Captain Gifford and his wife, were killed while apparently defending Edward Moore's territory. Strongholds in the Midlands, including Francis Cosby's once formidable fortress in Stradbally in Leix, were subsequently burned. So this pretty much gives you some picture of how close the plantation itself came to collapsing on many occasions. And these examples themselves, they illustrate that to serve within the county government of the two shires was to resign oneself to a really precarious existence. And it also highlights that ineffective captains, or effective captains even, as such as Henry Cowley, they were always a rarity and always in the minority. So I know that was quite quick, and I know I went through a lot of names over that period, but it gives you some idea of the turmoil of this local government that they tried to establish in Leix and Offaly. And really, it didn't resemble anything like the local government that they hoped to achieve, like there was in England. Really, what you had were military captains in charge of Fort Protector and Governor that became Maryborough and Phillipstown. And these were essentially just military forts. Any of the officers that were supposed to hold these offices were just essentially soldiers. There was really nothing more to them. And they didn't achieve much else than tarnishing Gaelic government relations for years to follow. But I would like to draw everybody's attention just super quick to the next part of my talk, which is going to be on Gaelic Irish loyalism. Now, it goes without saying that the captains of Leinster and Leix-Offaly plantation were by no means exclusively English. The widely acknowledged narrative of this period is one of English imperialists facing stern and complete resistance from the dispossessed and aggrieved factions of the Gaelic natives, who always strive for their independence. But in reality, this just wasn't the case at all. There were in fact several Irish Gaelic chieftains and their respective kin who were more than willing to cooperate with the Tudor crown and see their aspirations for the Midlands come to fruition. In fact, it would actually appear that it was the Gaelic Irish who approached the crown first and asked for, quote, a creation of name of dignity in return for holding on to their lands and maintaining their positions in their respective territories. Nationalist historians, by and large, have long viewed the whole notion of Gaelic Irish loyalism through somewhat of a narrow lens. Such a movement and such a move itself was deemed an acceptance and embracement of Englishness and foreignness, and in turn, a rejection of traditional Gaelic Irish identity and culture. But Gaelic Irish lords didn't see it this way, and they were far more driven by practicality and the embracement of surrender and regrant, which is what I mentioned before. It offered a realistic means of overcoming local rivals or symbolized conformity to the Tudor government in the hope that it would gradually deter them from subjugating their clan or a particular faction by force. In essence, many Gaelic nobles petitioned for English noble titles only as a means of preserving or strengthening their local positions. Gaelic society was hierarchical, and the overall concept of nobility was not unfamiliar to Gaelic lords. Instead of viewing the titles as slights or insults in any way, or even betrayal of Irish customs or ways of life, the offer of noble titles was too alluring to ignore and far from a mark of shame. So we have the Fitzpatricks, and they were the first clan to formally submit to the crown and see the benefits of collaboration. Their territory of Upper Ossory, which is now part of the southwest of Leix, was bordered by Kilkenny. And so they were always faced with the possibility of being overrun and dominated by Butler military might. And Upper Ossory being reshired as part of County Kilkenny. So they wanted to avoid this by all means necessary. And so the first to really submit was Brian Fitzpatrick. And what he chose to do, he actually apparently spoke no English and only communicated with the crown through Latin. He insisted that his son was not going to be in the same predicament. So he sent him to England to be raised at court. And he actually apparently became quite good friends with Edward, with the young eventual King Edward. And when he came back to Upper Ossory in the 1550s, he was deemed to be quite civilized in terms of, in the eyes of the English, and completely fluent in English. And he was unwilling to allow any Gaelic uprisings to occur within his territory or to jeopardize his newfound position. So what he basically did was overthrow his father, seize control of Upper Ossory for himself, and eventually he gained a knighthood for his loyal commitment to the crown. He was relentless against the O'Moores and the O'Connors, and he hunted them down without any real mercy throughout the 1550s and 60s and right up until the 1580. And he actually vowed, with the help of God, quote, to help to kill or banish the entire two clans. In July 1578, he allegedly was the one who hunted down and killed Rory Oge Moore. And when offered the reward of the bounty on Rory Oge's head, which was £100 at the time, he refused it and said what he did, what his actions were in service to the crown. He actually appealed for Upper Ossory to be made shire ground and actually joined to the Queen's County, which it eventually was in July 1600. So that was a success in the Crown's eyes, and as it was annexed to the Queen's County. We also had then on the border of Leix and into Offaly, we had the MacHugh O'Dempseys. And the O'Dempseys of Clanmalier primarily were in the north of Leix and modern day Ballybritis and around Geishel and Cloneygown. They were at war constantly with the O'Moores and the O'Connors. And the interesting thing was they actually were what were called the vassal lords of the O'Moores and the O'Connors. So they were expected to pay them a form of taxes and contribute armed forces to their campaigns. And so they weren't happy with this. And Owen MacHugh O'Dempsey himself was extremely unhappy with this. So he appealed to the crown to become a loyal servant, which he largely did. And he hunted down and actually killed Donogh MacBrien O'Connor in 1558, which essentially put an end to their rebellion. And he earned quite a good living. I think it was over £1,000 a year or something, really huge salary. And he actually acquired over 3,000 acres in the plantation himself. He became a part of the local government. He became a justice of the peace. And he also was a member of the county gentry for the two shires. They apparently were even, him and his fellow clansmen were even pardoned by the crown for their severity against their fellow clansmen who had rebelled against the crown, any of them who dared to rebel against the crown, and the O'Moores and the O'Connors himself. But it was actually in the year 1577, 1578 that actually truly exemplified the O'Dempseys' commitment to the government and English rule. And so the story goes that, quote, the people of Leix and Offaly were all summoned to show themselves with the greatest number that they could be able to bring with them. And on their arrival, they were surrounded on every side by 4 lines of soldiers and cavalry, who proceeded to shoot and slaughter them without mercy, so that not a single individual escaped by flight or force. And although the Gaelic sources implicated English settlers such as Francis Cosby or Robert Hartpole and Carlow as the main perpetrators in the massacre, it appears that Gaelic Irish collaborators such as Owen MacHugh O'Dempsey, they played a really significant role in hunting down their fellow Irishmen. His decision to partake in the massacre itself blew up in his face, as he was eventually hunted down and killed by one of Rory Oge's second-hand men, Niall MacLeish O'Moore, in 1578. And upon his death, and due to the fact that he had no offspring, his lands and his titles went to his nephew, Terence O'Dempsey. And by 1591, we know that Terence was an esquire, which is an upper level of English gentry, landed gentry. He was a member of the county government, and he was a sheriff by 1593. And he was said to have inflicted heavy defeats on Hugh O'Neill in 1598 and 1599, when he dared to enter Offaly, hoping to raise the O'Connors and the O'Carrolls in rebellion against the crown. He actually eventually gained a knighthood for his services. And it was said that in such a short period of time, he apparently transformed Offaly, or his domain in Offaly, into a really respective area of English law. It was actually said that he tilled the lands, he set up fences in the English system, and quote, in so barbarous a country, how well the ground was manured, how orderly their fields were fenced, their towns inhabited, and every highway and path so well beaten. From an Offaly perspective, then we know that the O'Carrolls also took part in this. We know that surrender and grant tore them apart from the inside. It really created significant tension within the clans itself. So the first lord to submit was a man by the name of Fergan Annam O'Carroll, and he submitted in July 1538 before he was killed and ousted from power by his own son Tig. Tig went on to receive a knighthood, but then in turn was murdered by his brother William. William went on to receive a knighthood as well, but his persistent loyalism to the crown bred intense hatred among the surrounding clans of the area, particularly the O'Connors. And he was ambushed and killed in 1581 by O'Connor soldiers. We know that William's son, John, he eventually succeeded his father, and then he in turn was killed by his brother, sparking another dynastic dispute. So really, for the government, by the end of the period, we know that they did, despite all the infighting, despite all the father and son toppling each other, we know that they did serve as examples to the rest of Ireland of how to increase royal revenue in Ireland and what they really hope to achieve, the crown that is, in transforming the Gaelic lordships into loyal subjects. Quote, they are lords of great countries and have been rebels, yet are subjects. Why? They have rivals. If they should not be subjects, they lose both their lands and their lives. Their surrender to Her Majesty is their only security. They cut off the heads of some of their name and nation, but those heads which they send in are better pledges of their own security than any kind of assurances of their loyalties. And you actually see this unravel even in the O'Connor clan. And it was essentially split in two between the MacBride clan and the MacHugh clan. And the MacHugh clan themselves, they submitted to the crown and were employed as crown kern. Now, what the MacHugh eventually became were freeholders, and they held their lands to the crown and assisted the government in hunting down the MacBride faction. So much so that they had to be pardoned, like the MacDempseys, for their services against the Irish, during which they may have offended against the rigors of the law. Geoffrey Fenton, who was the English writer, the Privy Council and Principal Secretary of State of Ireland, was even alleged to have said that had all the Gaelic Irish met a similar end, quote, no such disturbances would rise again in Leinster as hath been done through their quarrels. So what do we really draw from all of this? I suppose I would present somewhat of a counter case to the established narrative of 16th century Ireland. The Gaelic Irish case studies show us that what the administration could potentially have achieved throughout Leinster had they persuaded more Gaelic Irish chieftains to embrace the policy of surrender and grant. The evidence certainly suggests that the majority of clans that submitted were motivated by power, others by the prospect of significant financial gain and the extensive allotments of land. There were many clans who saw cooperation as a way of overcoming and removing a neighbouring rival's hold on their lordships, such as the O'Carrolls, the Fitzpatricks, and the O'Dempseys. For many of the smaller clans of the Midlands, assisting the Tudor government offered them military and financial security, but this always came at a price. And the overall policy resulted in extreme violence and conflict and infighting within clans. With regards to the English settlers themselves, they were certainly a mixed bag. There were apparently dutiful officers such as William St. Lo in the 1540s who promoted excessive violence against the early Gaelic Irish. Similarly, the 1550s and 60s presented us with officers such as Henry Radcliffe, who fulfilled their duties, but only through strict implementation of martial law. In the 1570s, as illustrated, numerous captains played a significant role in ensuring the government retained a foothold in the two counties, but really struggled to subdue the rebel threat. In addition, numerous captains were financially ruined as a result of their devotion, and some even paid with their lives. Yet, not every local government officer proved as willing to follow orders during this period, as demonstrated by captains such as Francis Cosby and Edward Moore. As emphasized, the case studies of negligent individuals such as these certainly suggest that the majority of English captains were concerned with little more than the acquisition of power, land, and wealth. Realistically, it is up to you, the general audience, to draw your own conclusion. Undeniably, there were plenty of officers that could be described as bad eggs, incredibly violent individuals who seemed to relish their task of persecuting the Gaelic Irish of their respective districts. Cosby, for instance, was said to have relished his role so much that he erected a gallows near his residence in Stradbally, where he would hang his unfortunate victims alive in chains, placing a loaf of bread just out of reach of the victim, and watch as they suffered an excruciating death from starvation. It goes without saying that martial law and the brutality by which it was executed greatly tarnished Gaelic government relations and did very little to advance English common law throughout the country. Martial law commissioners came to be viewed, particularly by the Gaelic Irish and even the inhabitants of the loyal English Pale, as little more than private conquerors, men of, quote, mean calling, out for their own gain, material and otherwise, who did as they pleased. The government certainly condoned the use of the sword to achieve their goals in Ireland. By wielding the sword, it was genuinely believed by the more, quote, civilized nations of Europe at the time that administrations such as the Tudor government fulfilled God's design for social order and progress. It was simply the case that martial law was more prevalent in Ireland because Gaelic Irish life was deemed less important and inferior in every way to English life. But I must stress that the history of 16th century Ireland is far from black and white. It certainly was a two-way street. Gaelic Irish society at the time was just as militaristic and violent as their English counterparts. Gaelic raids were seen as a way of displaying a lord's martial prowess and to appease their followers and impress their subjects. We know that during the rebellion of Silken Thomas Fitzgerald in the 1530s, it was widely reported that the Irish troops executed anyone they found of English birth, including women and children. The Tudor government responded in kind by crushing the revolt itself. And we know in the 1550s and 60s, all suspected enemies of the crown were permitted to be killed by government soldiers, and the soldiers themselves did not face any repercussions for their actions. The soldiers, in fact, were entitled to a third of the goods of any rebel that they killed. This also applied to the justices of the peace, who were allowed to hunt down and kill any Gaelic Irish bards, which of course was a singer or a poet for many Irish chieftains, employed by a patron, I suppose, to commemorate their ancestry and their deeds in battle. And they were allowed to do so and were offered a bounty on their heads for the more bards they brought in, the more heads, in fact, that they brought into the government. The Gaelic Irish always responded along the same lines, and they targeted farmers, soldiers, and their families throughout the plantation years. And these incidents mentioned throughout the century were standard for the time and the world over. It was just a much more violent world back then. So it was the full-scale epitome, I would argue, of the law of retaliation, otherwise known as an eye for an eye. So really quick, I just want to finish by giving some of the summary findings of my research on the Leix-Offaly plantations, outside of the men itself who took up positions in the local government and the Gaelic Irish themselves who partook in the enterprise. So we know the government wanted to transform the Gaelic lordships of Leix and Offaly into English counties and control the overall region. They wanted to remodel the midlands in the image of Ireland with as pure an English colony there as possible. And this they largely did actually achieve. The plantation was very much English in nature, and the settlers were overwhelmingly English and Welsh. They were very militarized and geared towards defense. And the evidence suggests that the entire political landscape of the two shires was actually conducted by a small but prominent group of just over 35 landowners. Whereas in the early stages of the enterprise, the Gaelic Irish were granted land in the two territories. By the late 1500s, they were completely excluded. The English and Welsh were far from prominent landowners, but still managed to carve out a modest living for themselves. So what do I mean by a modest salary? That would be someone like Thomas Merrick, who I mentioned earlier, who made just over £15 a year, which was a lot of money at the time. In England, the gentry regularly came together to coordinate strategies of defense, as they did in places like Louth and Meath. But they worked together on somewhat of a unified front against any and all resistance. But this didn't happen in Leix and Offaly. and the majority of the leading landowners, as I've mentioned, were self-serving. Military strongholds such as Fort Protector and Fort Governor, which eventually became Maryborough and Phillipstown respectively, were built to house English garrisons and secure English influence in the region, as well as policing the border of the Pale to protect its inhabitants from the constant incursions of the Gaelic Irish. But lacking a collective, unified blueprint for defence, the Queen's County and King's County were overrun on numerous occasions throughout the century, which threatened the very existence of the two shires, which only ever really seemed to hold on by the skin of its teeth, as did the plantation as a whole. As a result, then, you have all the castles and the strongholds and the towns themselves falling into ruin and general disrepair, and unable to really defend themselves sufficiently. The administration was always forced to install financially draining garrisons in the two counties, and this nearly bankrupted the treasury in London. Unsurprisingly, then, we know that the majority of the Gaelic Irish firmly resisted the plantation, and the main exceptions obviously are the ones that I've mentioned. But we do know by 1613, in the run-up to the first sitting of the Irish Parliament in 27 years, two Gaelic Irishmen, John McLaughlin and Calico Malloy in Offaly, who had strong traditions of loyalty to the government, they put their names forward as Knights of the Shire at an election in Phillipstown. The event served as further evidence of native willingness to cooperate with the Tudor regime in the hopes of obtaining a stake in the county government. By early 1604, Sir John Davies, the Solicitor General of Ireland, commented that he was pleased to find, quote, so many civil and substantial gentlemen and freeholders in the two counties. In a word, the public peace is well established. Furthermore, it was alleged that the English families who were uprooted by events such as Rory O'More's uprising, Oni MacRory O'More's uprising, and the 9-year war as a whole, actually returned to Leix and Offaly once the disturbances were over, to govern the country once again. Any Gaelic Irish that lived there, for the most part, apparently conformed themselves, quote, to civil life and gave their attendance very dutifully. And a great part of the people do willingly come to church, which of course they mean is the Protestant churches. By 1607, the Lord Deputy Anthony Chichester remarked that he considered the Queen's County in particular, quote, for the most part planted with English, and the kern and gentle idlemen, who are no longer departed to the wars abroad, now apply themselves to husbandry and tillage. They hope that more people of that quality break up and manure these, quote, waste grounds. Finally, by the year 1622, an Irish commission concluded that the plantation scheme in Leix and Offaly was a success, and the colony has, quote, prosperously continued, and was for the most part well peopled by the English and a great strength to the country. The inhabitants were also praised for having maintained their houses in the greatest extremities and dwelled and inhabited upon their plantations, which they wished were pursued in all other places in Ireland. So this was, I suppose, a testament to the Crown's perseverance in establishing a distinctive framework of English local government in the Midlands, a groundwork which was firmly implemented and firmly established by 1603, and obviously by and large by 1622. So what I want you all supposed to take away from all of it is that the plantation itself was deemed a success by the Crown in England, but really what it stood as was a blueprint for future colonial ventures across Ireland, which were far more successful, such as the Ulster plantation. So I just want to go back and draw your attention once again to the quotes I mentioned at the beginning. God has given such brave soldiers to the Crown that if they do not frighten our neighbours, at least they prevent us from being frightened by them. And I find that I send wolves, not shepherds, to govern Ireland, for they have left me nothing but ashes and carcasses to reign over. For me, and despite all the glowing reports from the Tudor officials back in London, these two quotes actually sum up what colonial ventures like the Leix-Offaly plantation actually brought about in Ireland by the 17th century. So I suppose I just want to thank you all for your time. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to answering any questions that you have. Thank you very much.
So, Diarmuid, thank you very much for an excellent lecture taking us through the Leix-Offaly plantation, but crucially, I suppose, not focusing just on what happened locally in Leix-Offaly, but starting by providing that wider context of looking at kind of wider plantation policy. You took in Scotland and Wales, Louth and Meath, and then you gave us quite a lot of detail about what happened locally, as well as, I think, drawing a lot of your themes together at the end. So thank you very much for an excellent and very valuable lecture. Now, before I go to the chat box, and again, I'd remind people to please insert any comments or questions you may have for Diarmuid. You can put them into the chat box. If I can ask you about your sources, Diarmuid, for your PhD research upon which this paper is arising from, what are the main sources that you looked at, and where are they?
So unfortunately, as many people may or may not know, the Gaelic Irish did not write a lot down, which is a real shame. And so a lot of the time, particularly in the 16th century, we tend to have a one-sided narrative throughout the period in question. But that being said, we do have several letters from Gaelic Irishmen writing to the Crown or writing to various Lord Deputies of what's happening within their local districts, what's happening within their local county. And suppose that really gives us somewhat of a more multifaceted view of what really transpired on the ground from a local perspective. And there are some sources. We have the Annals of the Four Masters, which were written in the 17th century. They do provide a lot of information, but of course it's nearly 100 years after a lot of the events happened. It's mainly the state papers, the Annals of the Four Masters, the Tudor Fiends were really invaluable to me when I was looking at stuff from a local perspective. And they were the main primary sources that I consulted. I suppose apart from that, then we had the various secondary material and all the historians of this period. So that's by and large the only sources we have to go on anyway, to try and form some sort of picture of what happened.
Okay. Grand. So, and speaking of sources and sticking with sources, I'm just looking there at some of the comments in the box. And Owen had asked, just before you turned to Mullaghmast, Owen was asking about, have you any thoughts or theory around the massacre at Mullaghmast? But I think you covered that.
I did. Any thoughts or theory about it? Not really, in the sense that I mean, the sources do not actually specifically mention the Gaelic Irish that took part in the massacre itself. But we do know you can read between the lines in a lot of the personal letters, where a lot of these men, like Cosby and Hartpole and that, they pretty much hint at taking a part in the massacre. And a lot of the Gaelic Irish themselves were under no illusions. In the Annals itself, it actually explicitly says that a lot of these men took a significant role in the massacre. But it really wasn't all that rare. There's loads and loads of accounts of various atrocities like Mullaghmast taking part, where Gaelic Irishmen are asked to come to a meeting or asked to come to some sort of a parley, particularly in these English captains' houses, and are subsequently murdered at the dinner table after dinner. There's loads and loads of cases of that, particularly the O'Moores talk a lot about it, and the O'Connors, I suppose, to a lesser extent. This is just scattered throughout the 16th century. But I mean, it was effective. It was extremely effective in gradually putting down Rory O'Moores' rebellion. And really, after the massacre itself, Rory's days were numbered. And he was on the run throughout the latter stages of his rebellion. And we know that he was eventually hunted down and killed by Barnaby Fitzpatrick. He was apparently hunted down and killed in a cave by Barnaby Fitzpatrick, who was his cousin, apparently. So this was just really common throughout the period, and yeah, pretty brutal stuff. Yeah. I'm sure that some people listening will recognize the story of the clan being murdered, wiped out at the wedding. Maybe there's some echoes there with Game of Thrones more recently. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that was very common. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they certainly didn't shy away from it, and they certainly proved themselves willing to do whatever needed to be done to put down any sort of Gaelic resistance, including Mullaghmast.
Yeah. So Rowan and Helen have questions again about primary sources, but we've touched on that. And then there's some other comments just thanking you. James Merrick says, Míle buíochas. Michael says, great lecture, Diarmuid. Sad time for the tribes and families of the Midlands. Why was there no unity among the families of the Midlands?
There never really was, which is a shame, and that was intentionally done by the English, by and large. This was intentionally, they wanted to sow the seeds of dissent from within the clans, and this is what they by and large did. And this was actually a very intentional policy that they implemented, which was to tear apart the clans from within and prevent any sort of unity. And that's a really tragic part. When you do see later in the period, particularly during Hugh O'Neill's rebellion in the 9 Years' War, even during Rory O'More's rebellion and everything like that, you see some semblance of unity among the clans. But the problem is, they always seem to tear themselves apart gradually from within and go back and defend their own holdings, their own territories, and their own domains. And that was paramount to them. And you know, the main problem was many of them weren't able to look past the practical parts of defending my own land, looking after my own family, own financial gain, own military dominance over their former overlords. There was loads and loads of cases of that, and it is a real shame that there was never really any unity. But it was an intentional policy implemented by the crown, is what they wanted to do. And they regularly there would be a chieftain in power. And his brother would appeal to the crown. He said, you know, I can take his position and I'll be loyal to the crown. So straight away, the crown would give him a huge army. He'd oust his brother from power and take over. And there's any semblance of unity gone. And it was crazy to see brothers kill fathers and cousins kill cousins, and the ruthlessness by which they did it to hold on to these land grants that they were given by the crown, to hold on to this new form of power that they were given, and the lengths that they went to achieve that is pretty scary.
Yeah. And immediately there, I can see that you've already answered a question by Fiachra Call, who asked, would you have any views on a strategy by the crown to encourage infighting amongst the Gaelic clans? So you very much touch on that. And more comments coming in. Thanks for a very interesting lecture. And Lorna Dooley asks, are the plantation maps you mentioned the Downs maps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of them are. Yeah.
Okay.
They're the main ones that we have to go by. Yeah.
Okay.
We have some of the older maps, which are kind of just a general survey maps. I think it's of the 50s. It was a while ago, obviously, since I did my research. I think it was the 50s that we have to go on, and they're actually quite accurate. It's quite scary. They're at the National Library in Dublin, and you could actually access them, and they're quite accurate. The border of the county itself doesn't resemble anything like what we know today, and Offaly included. It doesn't resemble anything like that. But actually, just in terms of a lot of where the positioning of individual towns or places is scarily accurate. Even, you know, the landscape itself, mountains and trees and stuff, it's really, really fascinating what they were able to do so long ago without the modern technology that we have nowadays for surveying and stuff like that. Really, really awesome stuff, yeah.
And on the question of maps, people might be interested that there's a forthcoming publication coming out from the Irish Manuscripts Commission by Annalay Margie, who's done a lot of work on plantations, and she is publishing a lot of the surviving plantation maps from the 16th and 17th centuries. So that's one to watch out for from the Manuscripts Commission. I'm going to start kind of wrapping up in terms of questions. I see John Rafter has one there. I was under the impression that the plantation of Leix-Offaly covered only the eastern parts of the present day counties, were the central and western parts of the counties planted later in the 17th century, and if so, how is this carried out?
Well, I mean, we do have obviously Upper Ossory, that was really a significant part of the Leix-Offaly plantation itself, because of people like Barnaby Fitzpatrick, who was so desperate to move away from Kilkenny or to go or to be absorbed in any way under Butler's domain, that he was insistent that the now modern part of County Laois on the west was absorbed into the Queen's County. So he pretty much fought for that throughout the 16th century. Really, from a 17th century perspective, I don't know. I haven't researched much because it was just ahead of my time. I really didn't look at it in any significant detail. But absolutely, it was primarily in the east, but we do know that a lot of the west also was absorbed. Even in the land grants themselves, we see a lot of territories being granted in the central part and in the west. And then we know obviously as well that a lot of the clans held a lot of control there. I know obviously you have the Fitzpatricks all over there in Castletown and Upper Ossory, but you have a lot of the other, like the O'Moores, who held a lot of land in the central and western part as well. So it certainly was included, but obviously it was primarily in the east was the main land grants. Yeah.
Okay.
And you also had a part, which kind of comes back to the original question on the government intentionally sowing division within the clans, a part of Rory Oak's domain known as Gallen, which they threatened to plant on several occasions. And they came up regularly with who are we going to find to plant this region? And they actually settled on own MacHugh O'Dempsey to settle the region, because they were like, he's loyal to the crown, he's the best person for the job. So it's just another interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's another question there asking you, Dermot, did you come upon any reference in the primary sources to Mount Mellick, Irishtown, Tinnakill, Rosenallis, or Cappahard?
Tinnakill, yes, because Tinnakill was apparently settled by MacDonalds or O'Donnells. Now, I'm not 100% certain which it was. It certainly was the MacDonalds or the O'Donnells, who were primarily Galloglass, mercenaries, primarily of Scottish origin, heavily armoured, who were given lands in Tinnakill in reward for their service to the crown. So you see Tinnakill pop up all the time throughout the 16th century. Mount Mellick, no, because Mount Mellick, I suppose, was much later in the 17th century when it was essentially established. Rosenallis, not really. No. What was the other places, Kieran?
The other ones were Mount Mellick, Irishtown.
No.
And
I didn't come across it.
Cappahard, I might be mispronouncing that.
Cappahard, yeah, Cappahard in the land grants, in the land grants, but really not really a whole lot of information, just that they were granted as part of the land grants in the region to English settlers, English and Welsh settlers, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask one more question, Dermot, if you don't mind. There's
sure,
more here, and then I'll hand over to our President, Helen Bracken, just after this. There's a question there from Anne-Marie saying, thanks, Dermot, for an excellent lecture. I should say there's an awful lot of those messages coming in. Thanks for an excellent lecture, very enjoyable. Was this infighting that we talked about a moment ago, was that the reason why Charles O'Carroll emigrated from Clarine during this period and was involved in the fight against the English in North America?
Ooh. I'm assuming that in the 17th century. It could very well have been. But you see, the O'Carrolls in particular are really interesting, because the O'Carrolls, unlike the O'Connors, had much more loyalist elements later in the 16th century and into the 17th century. And there wasn't as much infighting later in that period as there were in some of the other clans. So I'm not really sure, because I don't know enough about his emigration and that period. But certainly, I don't know. Honestly, I really don't know. I would just say that maybe not, because they were such a loyalist family by the latter half of the 16th century and into the 17th century. Maybe not, would be the only thing I could say. Yeah.
Okay, grand. So we'll leave the questions there, Dermot. So thanks a lot for expanding upon your lecture with engaging with those questions from our attendees. And I'll now hand over to our President, Helen Bracken, who will formally, I suppose, thank Diarmuid and bring the evening to a close. So Helen, I'm just bringing you in there.
Sorry, just trying. Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Helen. Yeah.
Yeah, but you can't see me. I better just trying to.
Okay.
Yes.
That's it there, Helen.
Is it?
Yeah, we can see it and hear you.
All right. Okay. I can't see it. Well, first of all, I'm delighted with the speaker. I mean,